A widow's whisper hides more than grief. Welcome to Clue Hunt. I am your host, Elena Gray. Tell me where you're watching from. I cherish every reply. Now let's listen closely to the silence. There was something odd about the way the wind moved around Elmswood House. It didn't whistle exactly, nor howl. It murmured as if the ivy-draped walls held onto old secrets, letting them slip through the cracks only when no one was listening. On the edge of St. Mary Mead, hidden behind a crumbling iron gate and two skeletal oak trees, the house belonged to Mrs. Edith Carrington, once elegant, now a widow of nearly 12 years, and a woman who rarely left her rooms. Miss Marple hadn't seen her in quite some time, not at the post office, not at church, not even at the harvest tea which Edith used to host with great pride. But a week ago a curious message had arrived. A note scrawled in neat handwriting, though slightly shaky, slipped under Miss Marple's door with no signature. There is a voice in my house, but only when I'm alone. Please, if anyone can help, it's you. Miss Marple didn't move hastily. She believed in watching and waiting, especially when it came to matters of the heart and madness. But something about the wording struck her. Not fear, not panic, just a quiet sort of despair, a whisper in ink. So one grey morning, wrapped in a soft shawl and carrying a tin of shortbread, Miss Marple knocked on the door of Elmswood House. The front hall was cold, and the carpets had thinned with age. Edith Carrington greeted her in a deep green velvet dress, her white hair pinned into a graceful roll. Her eyes were alert, but behind them sat a kind of sorrow that time hadn't quite managed to erase. "I knew you'd come," she said. "Miss," Marple smiled gently. "I don't believe in ghosts, you know, but I do believe houses remember things." They sat in the drawing room, where the air smelled faintly of dried roses and burnt coal. Edith poured tea with practiced hands. Her voice was steady, but she glanced over her shoulder often toward the old door that led upstairs. "It began a month ago," she said, "after the storm knocked loose some of the shutters. I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it and a voice faint and dry saying my name." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And what did it say precisely?" "Only, 'Edith, look beneath,' that's all." "And what did you do?" Edith gave a soft laugh. "Nothing. What was I supposed to do? I thought I was imagining it. But it's happened 3 times since, always when the fire dies low, always just before I sleep." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And you live alone?" "Entirely. The housekeeper comes only in the mornings. I lock the doors myself, and I've never been prone to nerves." Miss Marple nodded slowly, glancing at the heavy curtains and the antique clock ticking on the mantel. The room held history, certainly. Photographs in silver frames, shelves of books with gold-lettered spines, and above the fireplace a portrait of a man in uniform. "Your late husband?" Edith's eyes softened. "Yes. Major Carrington. Served in India. Died of fever, so they said." Miss Marple caught the subtle shift in her tone, "so they said." Edith hesitated. "I never saw the body. Only a letter from the consulate and a box of his belongings. That was 12 years ago. But something has never sat right with me. There were things he never explained. Documents burned. Conversations ended abruptly. He used to lock his study at night." Miss Marple sat back. "And you never went in?" "Not until after his death. And even then it felt forbidden. But there was nothing unusual, only books, journals, and a locked drawer. I never opened. Still locked?" "I believe so." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think we should take a look." Miss Marple stood in the center of Major Carrington's old study, a room that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old leather, though the man himself had been gone for over a decade. The walls were lined with dark oak shelves bearing books on military history, colonial architecture, and maps of India, each spine carefully dusted. A small globe sat beside a heavy brass lamp, and directly across from it stood a deep walnut desk with lion-foot legs and polished brass handles, heavy, dignified, and distinctly locked. Edith Carrington stood quietly at the threshold, her hand resting on the edge of the door, her eyes not on the desk, but on a portrait that hung just above it, a painting of her husband, seated in uniform, a knowing half-smile caught on his lips that, now more than ever, gave her a chill. "He never let me touch this room when he was alive," she said softly. "Even after his death I rarely entered. It always felt occupied." Miss Marple nodded. She was no believer in ghosts, nor did she fear the dead, but she had long known that places retained memory, and some rooms breathed with the past more than others. She walked to the desk and ran her fingers lightly along the surface. The lock was old but not fragile. She reached into her handbag and with the tiniest hint of mischief withdrew a small brass skeleton key. Not a perfect match, but a clever one. "It's quite shocking what one can find at church jumble sales," she murmured with a faint smile, and with a gentle twist the drawer gave way. Inside was not clutter, but curation. A thick leather journal wrapped in cloth, a faded telegram, a worn envelope with foreign stamps and a broken wax seal, and a small velvet box. Miss Marple lifted each item carefully, like relics in a chapel. Edith drew closer, as though breaking some silent barrier, and looked over Miss Marple's shoulder as she opened the journal. Its pages were dated, written in a strong, square hand, Major Carrington's, and the first entries were mundane enough. Notes on troop movements, the monsoon season, and frustrations with the chain of command. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted. He wrote of a woman named Amira, not as a romantic interest, but as someone important. A translator, perhaps. There were mentions of secret messages, coded wires, and distrust within the regiment. Then, abruptly, the entries stopped. No explanation. No farewell. Just blank pages after a final line. "She knows too much. I fear for her." Edith stepped back. "I've never heard that name in my life." He never mentioned any woman from India. Miss Marple set the journal aside and picked up the telegram. It was dated 2 weeks before the official notice of his death. The message was terse, military in tone. "Compromised asset. Extraction denied. Final action initiated. File C sealed." There was no sender's name, no base location, just a string of numbers and letters in the corner. A cipher Miss Marple made note of silently. The velvet box, when opened, contained a woman's locket, not Edith's. Inside it, a miniature photograph, sepia-toned, of a young woman with large eyes and a crescent moon pendant at her neck. On the back, one word, handwritten, Amira. Edith sat heavily in the armchair beside the fireplace. Her hands were trembling. "He had a life I never knew, a war beyond the uniforms and the medals. Why hide it from me?" Miss Marple sat gently beside her. "Sometimes the things we hide are not because of shame, but because we fear the consequences of truth. Perhaps he believed silence would keep you safe." Edith looked at her. "Then why now? Why the whisper? Why the voice in the dark?" Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the items once more. "Because something, or someone, has returned. Someone wants these pieces, or wants them buried again." That night, Miss Marple took the journal home with Edith's reluctant blessing. She spent hours cross-referencing the cipher code in the telegram with old war logs she had once helped catalogue for the Women's Auxiliary Corps after the war. She was slow, but exacting, and by dawn, she had a partial match. CC wasn't a C at all. It was a code designation for a covert station near Bombay, decommissioned after 1947. The cipher matched a file that had been marked sealed due to breach of conduct by foreign intermediary. Miss Marple frowned. It was Amira. She had been part of an intelligence transfer, and the Major had protected her, possibly at the cost of his own life. By midday, she visited the vicar, Reverend Martin, who had once served in a signals unit and still kept records from his army days. She didn't reveal the full matter, not yet, but she asked him quietly if he had ever come across a woman named Amira, connected to British units in India. The vicar paused, then said he had once met a woman by that name at a peace conference. In 1952, she had spoken perfect English, worn a crescent pendant, and refused to answer any questions about her past. She had eyes, he said, that had seen betrayal. Miss Marple returned to Elmswood House with this knowledge tucked safely in her mind. Edith met her at the gate, holding an envelope. "This was pushed through the letterbox," she said. "There's no return address." Inside was a single scrap of paper, no larger than a calling card. Not all whispers are echoes, some are warnings. Burn the journal. Miss Marple folded the note carefully. Her eyes hardened slightly, though her face remained composed. "Someone knows we've found something, and they don't want us to finish reading it." That night, she sat beside her lamp and read the final scattered pages of the journal. Entries that had been written in the margins, sideways, as though the writer was running out of time and space. In one, Major Carrington confessed that Amira had smuggled out not just messages, but names. Names of British officers willing to sell information to foreign agents. The implication was staggering. And among those names, barely legible, was one Miss Marple recognized from her own village. Berkeley. She whispered it aloud. Colonel Harold Berkeley had retired to St. Mary Mead just 4 years prior. He kept to himself, rarely attended. Colonel Harold Berkeley had always kept a low profile in the village. He was polite but distant, the kind of man who gave short nods instead of hellos. He didn't like small talk, but he liked being observed even less. Miss Marple knocked on the door with her usual gentle touch. After a moment it creaked open. The colonel stood there, dressed in a navy cardigan and beige trousers, his expression tight with surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, "everything all right?" She smiled sweetly. "I wonder if I might borrow a few minutes of your time. I have some questions about India, about a woman named Amira." His hand froze on the doorknob. The pause told her enough. Still, he nodded and opened the door wider. Inside, the cottage was neat, with shelves lined with military biographies and maps in heavy frames. A small fire burned in the hearth, though it wasn't cold enough to need it. They sat opposite each other with a pot of tea between them. Miss Marple didn't waste time. "You were once stationed in Bombay, were you not? Around 1947? "Yes," the colonel replied, briefly. "Then perhaps you knew Major Carrington." Berkeley's jaw shifted. "He was respected." "And what about Amira?" This time, he didn't answer. Instead, he poured himself a second cup of tea, even though the first was still half full. "She was a translator," Miss Marple said softly, "a brilliant one. But she knew more than she was supposed to. The Major tried to protect her, but someone betrayed them both. Someone who feared what she might say." Berkeley's voice, when it came, was flat. "You shouldn't meddle in things that happened half a lifetime ago." Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "I only meddle when something echoes into the present, and right now, someone is trying to silence the past." Again, she reached into her handbag and pulled out the anonymous note from Elmswood House. The colonel barely glanced at it. He stood up and turned toward the fireplace. "She was brave," he said finally. "Smarter than most of us. But she was being used by both sides. Carrington couldn't see that." "So you made sure she disappeared," Miss Marple said quietly. He didn't deny it. "I didn't kill her," he said. "But I did write the report that made her an enemy. It was what we were trained to do." He turned to face her again. "But I never wanted Carrington dead." Miss Marple rose slowly. "That's something you'll have to live with, Colonel. The truth has waited long enough." She left him standing there, the fire flickering behind his eyes. That evening, as shadows gathered over Elmswood House, Edith Carrington drew the curtains early. The house felt different since the journal was found. Less cold, perhaps, but still unsettled. The clock struck 8. She stirred the fire, then paused. She heard it again. A voice. But this time it wasn't calling her name. It was whispering something else. In the wall. Behind the frame. Edith froze. She turned toward the hallway where the old portrait of the Major hung just outside the study. She approached slowly, heart pounding. With trembling hands, she lifted the frame. Behind it, just where the wall panels met, was a narrow seam, a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, was a second envelope. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter. It was written in delicate, slanted handwriting. Not Peter Carrington's. It was Amira's. To Edith Carrington. If you are reading this, then truth has outlived silence. Your husband tried to save me. They turned on him, but he did not fall in vain. There are things I was not meant to survive, but I did. I live, quietly. I am safe, because he lied for me. This is my thanks. Tears slipped down Edith's cheeks. He had known. He had saved her, and perhaps in doing so had saved himself in some way. Miss Marple returned to the house just as Edith finished reading. I heard the voice again, Edith whispered. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was direction. Miss Marple nodded. Slowly. Some whispers, she said, are not from the past, they're instructions left for the right ears. They sat by the fire, the letter open between them, and for the first time in 12 years the widow at Elmswood House felt peace. Not because the mystery was solved, but because the silence had spoken and been heard. The next morning brought a strange stillness to Elmswood House. The air was crisp, the skies pale and washed with light, and yet something inside the walls felt changed. Edith Carrington had not slept much. The letter from Amira lay beside her bed, read again and again in the candlelight, her fingers brushing the delicate, slanted writing as if touching the past itself. When she stepped into the drawing room, there was a quiet sense of purpose in her movements. She no longer flinched at the sound of floorboards or questioned what shadows might whisper. Instead, she lit a small fire, brewed fresh tea and waited, because she knew Miss Marple would return, and she did. With her usual gentle knock and a calm smile, Miss Marple entered the room holding a small bundle of papers. "Good morning, my dear. I hope you're ready for something quite surprising." Edith sat down slowly. "After last night, I'm ready for almost anything." Miss Marple unfolded the pages, old reports, handwritten notes, and a recently printed letter with an official seal. "I spent much of the night going through military archives and some private collections. You'd be amazed what one can access when the archivist's niece attends your knitting club." Edith smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed fixed on the papers. Miss Marple continued. "There was indeed a woman named Amira Khan. She worked as a translator, yes, but she was also something more. An informant for both the British and the Indian Independence Network. She played a dangerous game. But your husband, he chose to protect her when it mattered most." She pointed to a document. "This, here, is a record from 1948. A classified transfer from Bombay to a place called Marienbad in Europe. The name is redacted, but the initials match Amira's and the date matches the day after your husband's supposed death." Edith leaned forward. "So he faked her disappearance?" Miss Marple nodded. "He likely convinced someone high enough to grant her a new identity. on condition that she never contact anyone from her old life. But he left behind clues, enough to guide you if danger ever returned. Edith's voice dropped. And now it has. Miss Marple sat back. Yes, because someone in this village has learned that Amira survived, and they don't want her truth to come out. Edith was silent for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the mantelpiece. She reached behind a small framed photo and pulled out the envelope Amira had left. She said she lives quietly, Edith whispered. Could we find her? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. We may not have to. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned home and placed a quiet call through the village operator. She left a message, very simple, very deliberate, for someone she hadn't spoken to in years. A woman named Meena Desai, a former librarian, in London, with an uncanny memory and deep connections to post-war relocation programs. The message was short. Need to find a woman once known as Amira Khan, possibly relocated under British protection, may still be alive. Please reply urgently. 2 days passed. Then a letter arrived, hand-delivered by a cyclist Miss Marple didn't recognize. The envelope bore no return address. Inside, a single sentence. She lives in Sussex. Name Amira Darzi. Private cottage, edge of the Downs. She knows you're looking. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it in her handbag. She packed a fresh pair of gloves, her favorite brooch, and a tin of shortbread. Then she called for a car and set out that very afternoon. It was a quiet road, winding through the green Sussex hills, with sheep grazing in the distance and the sea just visible on the horizon. The cottage was modest, built of pale stone and covered in vines. A small brass bell hung near the door. Miss Marple rang it once. The door opened almost immediately. The woman who stood before her was older now, perhaps late 60s, with silver threads in her black hair, soft lines around her mouth, and eyes that held stories too heavy for most to carry. Around her neck hung a crescent moon. Miss Marple, she said. Miss Marple smiled gently. So it is you. Amira stepped aside. I've been waiting for this moment. They sat together in a sunlit sitting room filled with books and jasmine plants. Tea was served in ceramic cups and a warm breeze passed through the open windows. Amira spoke first. I was never meant to survive, she said, but Peter gave up everything to ensure that I did. He made enemies, Miss Marple, powerful ones. Some of them still live. They believe truth is a threat. And now someone has found me. Miss Marple listened quietly. There were whispers, Amira continued, even before your letters. Phone clicks, a van outside, a shadow in my garden. I thought I could stay hidden, but Peter's name coming back into the open must have triggered something. Miss Marple leaned forward. There is still someone protecting that old betrayal, and I believe they are watching Edith Carrington now, perhaps even planning something worse. Amira's hands trembled slightly. Then it's time I returned, she said. I owe Edith the truth. I owe Peter that much. Miss Marple stood. I'll come with you, but we'll need to be cautious. Back in St. Mary Mead, as twilight settled over the village, Edith sat by her window, staring at the gate. She had the strange sense that something, or someone, was coming, and for once she wasn't afraid. The next morning dawned with heavy mist clinging low over St. Mary Mead, the kind of fog that made hedgerows vanish and the postman appear, like a ghost between lanes. Miss Marple stood by the window of Elmswood House, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She wasn't watching the garden, but the gate. She had returned early before sunrise, after leaving Amira at a safe guest house 2 villages away. It had been a careful journey, quiet, without announcement. But Miss Marple knew eyes watched this house now, and today the truth would no longer remain in hiding. Inside, Edith moved quietly through the rooms. Her face was drawn but no longer afraid, She felt something nearing, not danger exactly, but reckoning. She had laid out the old photographs, the journal and the letter from Amira. Miss Marple had asked her to be brave today, and Edith had agreed, though her hands still trembled slightly as she poured tea. At exactly 10 o'clock there was a knock at the front door. Miss Marple opened it herself. Standing there, quite dignified in a pressed coat and polished shoes, was Colonel Harold Berkeley. Removed his hat slowly. "Good morning," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Won't you come in?" The drawing room was warm and bright, but the atmosphere had a quiet sharpness, like the stillness before a storm. Colonel Berkeley's eyes passed over the items laid out on the table, and he immediately stiffened when he saw Amira's letter. "You've spoken to her," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and she remembers everything, including you." Berkeley exhaled heavily and sat down. "She shouldn't have come back." "She hasn't," Miss Marple replied. "Not yet, but she will, unless you have something you'd rather confess before that happens." The Colonel looked old in that moment, older than Edith had ever seen him. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "This came to me last week," he said. "Anonymous, typed. It warned me not to let the truth come out. Said there were still those who wouldn't hesitate to make sure the past stays buried." He slid the paper across the table. "Miss Marple, read it silently." The language was clipped, precise. No emotion, just a clear warning. "The woman knows too much. You will be held accountable if she speaks. Act accordingly." She looked at the Colonel. "So, what was your plan?" He was silent for a moment. Then, reluctantly, he spoke. "I was going to warn her, persuade her not to return, not to stir the hornet's nest. But I swear to you, Miss Marple, I would never harm her. Not Edith. Not Amira." Edith's voice, quiet and steady, broke the silence. "Then help us," she said. "Help us uncover who still wants her silenced." The Colonel nodded slowly. "There were 3 names on the original file," he said. "Carrington, myself, and another. A man who went by the code name Ashbridge. I never met him in person. He was senior to all of us. Passed messages through encrypted channels. I always assumed he died after the war." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "But what if he didn't?" Berkeley hesitated. "Then he's the one watching, and he's closer than we think." Later that evening, as dusk curled through the village like soft smoke, a figure in a long coat stood silently across the road from Elmswood House. Hidden partially behind a hedge, he watched the windows glow and flicker. His breath fogged in, the cold air. He took out a small notebook and made a mark with his pen. A shape moved behind the curtain, a silhouette he didn't recognize. A woman. Not Edith. He narrowed his eyes, then turned and walked away. Back inside the house, Miss Marple carefully closed the curtain and turned to Edith. "He's watching." Edith's hand clenched around her teacup. Miss Marple continued. "He thinks he's still in control, but he doesn't know we've changed the game." Just then the doorbell rang again. It was Amira, wrapped in a soft coat, eyes cautious but determined. She stepped into the room with grace and weight. Edith rose to her feet. The 2 women stood face to face, the widow and the ghost. No words were spoken at first. Just a long moment of seeing, of knowing. Then Edith whispered, "You were worth saving." Amira took her hand gently. "So were you." Miss Marple smiled softly as she turned toward the fireplace. The shadows on the wall no longer seemed quite so large. But in the village beyond, the real danger was only just beginning to stir. The rain began just after dawn, a thin, misty drizzle that clung to windows and gathered quietly in the corners of stone steps. Elmswood House looked peaceful from the outside, its lamps glowing faintly behind lace curtains. But inside the air was sharp with anticipation. Amira sat near the fireplace, her hands resting gently on her lap, while Edith moved around the room with a strange calmness. setting the tea tray with quiet care. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the lane, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, her eyes alert. She had not slept much. Her mind had been turning over names, details, fragments of forgotten reports. But one name had risen again, and again: Ashbridge, a code name, a shadow, a man without a face, until now. She turned toward the others. "I've set the wheels in motion," she said softly. "By this evening he will make a move, and we must be ready." Edith paused in pouring the tea. "How can you be certain he'll come?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, but there was steel beneath. "Because I've left him no choice. I've sent a letter, anonymous in appearance, but very specific in content. I've told him the journal will be handed to the press tomorrow, and I've told him we know who he is." Amira sat upright. "And do we?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I believe so, but I need proof. Tonight we'll have it." The trap was simple in design, but dangerous in its execution. Colonel Berkeley, now fully cooperating, had agreed to meet Miss Marple at the vicarage under the pretense of surrendering the journal to a journalist. Meanwhile, Edith and Amira would remain at Elmswood, the journal hidden in plain sight on the study desk, a lure no man with secrets could resist. Miss Marple was certain Ashbridge would not attempt a public act. He was too clever, too quiet. He would come when the house was still, when only the widow remained. By evening, the village was cloaked in fog, the kind that swallowed sound and softened footsteps. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, her steps slow but sure. Inside, Colonel Berkeley waited with Reverend Martin, a man who had once deciphered enemy codes but now spent his days arranging hymn sheets. Together they prepared the decoy, a sealed brown envelope filled with blank paper and tied with red string. At the same time, Edith lit the fire in the drawing room and placed the journal on the desk. Amira sat in a high-backed chair, half-shadowed, her eyes fixed on the hallway. They spoke very little. The silence in the house was deep, not heavy with fear, but with expectation. At 9:47 p.m., the back door creaked. Edith froze. The front of the house remained still, the curtains drawn tight. Amira stood, moving behind the door where a narrow alcove gave perfect cover. She held nothing in her hands. She needed only to listen. Footsteps came down the hallway, slow, measured. Then a figure entered the room, tall in a dark coat, a scarf pulled high over his face. But even in the shadows, Edith recognized the way he moved, with authority, with purpose. He went straight to the desk. He picked up the journal, and then he spoke, in a calm voice. Fascinating how silence becomes a weapon. I taught Carrington that. Edith stood, facing him directly. "So you are Ashbridge." The man removed the scarf. His face was older now, but smooth, calculated. He had once been introduced at a village event as Mr. Alan Reeves, a retired civil servant from Whitehall. No one had thought to question it. Why would they? Amira stepped out from behind the door. "You used me," she said, her voice steady. "You let them kill him." Reeves blinked. "He made a choice. You both did. And now you've dragged it into daylight. I should have ended this long ago." He moved suddenly, not with violence, but toward the fireplace, reaching behind a row of books where a pistol had been hidden decades ago. But before he could grip it, a voice rang out behind him. "That will do." Miss Marple stood in the doorway, the colonel just behind her, and beside him, two constables, quietly called in from the next county, waiting silently until the very moment required. Reeves froze. He turned slowly. "Always underestimated," he muttered. Miss Marple stepped forward. "That has always been your greatest weakness, Mr. Ashbridge. You see silence as vulnerability, but silence is often where strength gathers." The officers moved in. Reeves did not resist. As he was led out, he glanced once at Amira. You were never meant to speak." She said nothing in return. He was gone. That night, the fire at Elmswood burned warmer than it had in years. Edith poured 3 cups of tea, each set carefully on the table. Amira looked out the window, not with fear, but with clarity. "He kept his promise," she said quietly. "Peter, he protected me, even after death." Miss Marple smiled gently. "And you, in return, gave voice to the silence." No one said anything for a while. The fog had lifted. The whispers were gone. Only peace remained. The days that followed the arrest of Alan Reeves, the man once known as Ashbridge, passed in a strange quietness over St. Mary Mead. Not the kind of hush that comes from fear, but rather the sort that settles after a storm has emptied its clouds and the air feels new again. Elmswood House, long heavy with silence and shadows, now held light in its windows and warmth in its rooms. Amira stayed on for a few days at least. Edith insisted, and Amira, despite her instincts to disappear again, agreed. There were still things to say, not just between them, but within themselves. Miss Marple, meanwhile, turned her attention to the garden. It was on a quiet Thursday morning that she wandered through the back garden of Elmswood, where the roses grew in long-faded rows, and the earth held the stories of decades. The air was crisp and the sky hung low with grey softness. She moved slowly along the stone path, her cane gently tapping the moss-covered edges. It wasn't a random stroll. Something had been bothering her, a detail out of place. The garden had once been the Major's pride. Edith had said as much. But in recent years no gardener had come, and yet one section, just beyond the hedge near the shed, had clearly been disturbed. The soil there was darker, looser, as if something had been dug and filled again. And in the center of that patch, oddly enough, stood a single iron stake. It didn't belong to any visible trellis or support. Miss Marple knelt beside it slowly. Her joints protested, but her mind did not. She brushed away some of the topsoil, her fingers moving carefully, respectfully. Just beneath the surface, she found a rusted tin box, not very large, the kind used for old tobacco or tea. She lifted it out and opened the lid. Inside were 3 items: a faded photograph, a set of worn dog tags, and a letter wrapped in oilcloth. The photograph was of Peter Carrington, younger, smiling in full uniform, standing beside Amira in what appeared to be a garden not unlike this one. They were not posed. It had been taken quickly, perhaps secretly. The emotion was undeniable. The dog tags bore his name, but Miss Marple frowned, because these tags, they were different from the ones Edith had shown her, the official ones kept after his death. These had been hidden, and on the back, crudely, etched were the words, "Trust her, she saw it all." Miss Marple unwrapped the letter next. It was written in Peter's hand, a farewell, but not to Edith. It was to Amira. "If they come for me, I won't resist, because resistance will lead them to you. I have done what I can. I only hope Edith understands one day. Bury this in the garden where you stood that night, where we said it aloud. Truth matters. I know you'll keep it safe, and if anyone finds it, let them know I had no regrets." Miss Marple sat in silence for a long moment. This wasn't just a man protecting a woman. This was a man confessing love, loyalty, and a choice made without regret. She rose slowly and returned to the house. Inside, Amira and Edith were seated together by the fire, playing a quiet game of chess. There was a calm between them now, not free from grief, but filled with grace. Miss Marple placed the tin box on the table without a word. They opened it together. Tears welled in Edith's eyes, not from shock, but from something else entirely. "He loved her," she whispered, "and yet he never betrayed me." Amira nodded gently. "We were part of something larger than love, but in the end it was love that kept us alive." That evening, Amira stood at the gate with her small bag packed. Her time in the village had come to an end. There were places she could go, quietly, safely, where names didn't matter and stories could sleep. But before she left, she took Edith's hand in hers. "I will never forget what he gave me, or what you gave him." Edith held her gaze. "Nor will I forget who whispered in the dark so I could finally hear the truth." Miss Marple watched from the step, a faint smile at her lips. The mist rolled low across the lane, but the sky above held a faint band of light. As the car carried Amira away, the village settled once again into quiet rhythm. But the garden at Elmswood now held something new, not just memory, but peace. And Miss Marple, ever observant, ever calm, knew one thing: more truth, when buried, will always find a way back to bloom. The morning after Amira's departure was still and quiet, with only the occasional bird call echoing across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple stood before her parlour window, watching the ivy sway gently outside. Though peace had returned, to Elmswood House and Edith Carrington had begun to smile again, there was something, just a flicker of a thought, that tugged at Miss Marple's mind. A loose thread, the kind that never stayed still for long. It wasn't a fear exactly, more like a hum of unfinished music, and it had to do with the past, not Peter Carrington's nor Amira's, but something more local, more ordinary, and that, to Miss Marple, was where real danger always preferred to hide. She wrapped a soft blue scarf around her shoulders and made her way down the lane to the vicarage. Reverend Martin, a kindly man with mild eyes and slightly frayed cuffs, greeted her with his usual warmth. "A most extraordinary business, Miss Marple," he said, ushering her into the study. "I must admit, I never suspected Mr. Reeves of anything more sinister than snoozing during evensong." Miss Marple gave a soft smile. "Indeed, Reverend, it is always the quiet ones who hold the deepest secrets." She sat down, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "I was wondering if I might take a look through the parish ledgers. I remember you once mentioned your predecessor, Reverend Trelling, kept meticulous notes. Every visitor, every funeral, every confession not under seal." The Reverend blinked. "Well, yes, though I never imagined them of interest to anyone but myself. They might be, Reverend," she said gently. "Sometimes answers hide where no one thinks to look." With a nod, he led her into the vestry, where an old wooden cabinet stood beneath a dusty crucifix. Inside were books, thick, leather-bound and labelled by year. Miss Marple selected the volume marked 1948, the year of Peter Carrington's alleged death. She sat by the window and turned the pages slowly, reading the careful script. Marriages, deaths, donations, sermons. Nothing unusual. Until one entry caught. Her I. April 14th, 1948. Funeral requested, no service held, no body present. Name, PC. Requested by senior official from London. Grounds sealed, no public notice. Reverend instructed not to inquire further. Miss Marple's finger lingered on the note. No body, no service, no notice, and initials only. PC Peter Carrington. She turned to the final page of the ledger. There, tucked into the fold, was a loose sheet of paper, brittle with age but preserved by habit. It was a letter unsigned. To the keeper of this book: "If ever you read this and ask why, know that duty once demanded silence. The man was buried in name only. His soul was claimed. By no church, his memory by no grave. But one day someone will come seeking not bones but truth. Show them the ledger. That is all I can give." Miss Marple's eyes softened. So even then, someone had sensed the lie. Perhaps Reverend Trelling had felt it too. She closed the book and stood. "Reverend Martin," she said gently, "this may be more valuable than any sermon this village will ever hear." He looked puzzled but nodded. As she walked back toward her cottage, the sky shifted, blue pressing through grey. She knew now that Peter Carrington had never been meant to be remembered, not properly. And yet he had been, by a vicar with a pen, by a woman who heard whispers, by a village that had unknowingly protected secrets for decades. At Elmswood, Edith sat at her writing desk, beginning a letter. To Amira, to say she had found a place for the photograph, in the garden near the roses, where stories could grow and the truth had finally taken root. Miss Marple watched from the garden gate, then turned, her steps light, her heart sure. The whisper was fading now, not because it had disappeared, but because it had finally been heard. It was late morning in St. Mary Mead when the letter arrived, slipped quietly through Miss Marple's letterbox, caught delicately by the corner of the patterned rug near the door. Nothing about it appeared unusual at first glance. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting neat but unassuming, the postage stamped faintly in red. But it was the return mark that caught her attention, a post office seal from Bombay, now called Mumbai. Miss Marple held it gently, as one might hold an unfamiliar seed, aware it might bloom into something unexpected. She set her teacup aside and opened the envelope with care. Inside was a single folded sheet. The paper was coarse, slightly yellowed, and smelled faintly of spice and dust. She unfolded it slowly and read, "Dear Miss Marple, my name is Agatha Khan. I am the niece of Amira Khan. You may not know me, but my aunt once spoke of a quiet Englishwoman with sharp eyes and a heart too large for the small village she lived in. I write to you because my aunt passed away 3 weeks ago. She had been ill, though she never spoke much of it. She lived peacefully and quietly, with a small garden and a faithful dog. She did not fear the end. Before she died, she asked me to send this letter. She said, 'If I go before I can return again, tell her it was enough. Tell her she helped.'" We finished the story. She also asked me to pass along a small notebook. I have enclosed it with this letter. It is hers. She said you would know what to do with it. Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing her, for believing her. Yours sincerely, Agatha Khan. Miss Marple paused. A long silence followed, filled only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint sound of wind against the windows. She felt no surprise. Amira had lived many lives, and Miss Marple suspected that the quiet end she chose was her final act of control in a world that had so often tried to silence her. But the weight in the envelope was more than grief. There was something else. She reached into the envelope again and pulled out the notebook. It was small, leather-bound, worn at the edges. A thin blue ribbon marked the middle pages. The initials AK were pressed into the lower corner. She opened it carefully. Inside were notes, names, dates, observations, part diary, part confession. It detailed events from the days in India after Peter's disappearance, including fragments about men who moved between empires, women whose voices were bought and buried, and a truth that had never been published. A secret network formed after the war to erase those who had become inconvenient to power. Miss Marple read for hours. She made tea and let it grow cold. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders. She did not move. When she finally closed the book, she knew what had to be done. That evening, she walked to Elmswood House. Edith answered the door. She looked older somehow, not in the way grief does, but in the way reflection does, the kind of age that comes from knowing things one cannot unknow. Miss Marple handed her the notebook. "She wanted you to read this too." Edith nodded slowly. "Did she write of me?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "Not directly, but her silence on your name was the deepest form of respect I've ever read. She trusted you would know your part without needing to be told." Edith took the notebook and held it close. Later they sat together near the fire, neither speaking for some time. Outside, The sky held that curious blue of dusk, where day and night seemed to hold hands for just a moment. In the hearth, the flames danced. "So, finally," Edith said, "is it wrong to want the world to remember him as mine, even knowing he gave his heart to someone else too?" Miss Marple reached for her cup. "No, my dear, because in the end he gave his truth to both of you. One he loved, the other he trusted with his legacy. There are many kinds of devotion." They sat a little longer. Then Miss Marple stood. "I believe I'll write a letter of my own," she said. "There are historians who deserve to read this journal, but they must be the right ones, those who value people more than power." Edith nodded. "And the garden? We'll let it bloom." Outside, a single rose had opened early, its petals delicate and pale in the dusk, and in a small cottage in Mumbai, a niece tended to her aunt's jasmine, not knowing that thousands, 12 miles away, the final chapter of a long-held whisper had just been gently closed, not in silence but in truth. London always felt different to Miss Marple, louder, faster, more distracted by its own movement. But beneath the rush of buses and footsteps and business suits lay something deeper, something slower, the quiet machinery of the past, humming still in the corners of old buildings and forgotten offices. That morning, wrapped in a soft grey coat and holding her handbag firmly, Miss Marple stepped off the train at Paddington Station. She was not here for sightseeing. She had an appointment, and she did not intend to leave without answers. A taxi ride took her through winding streets until they reached a narrow, nondescript building near Lincoln's Inn Fields. It was made of clean stone, with no sign above the door, only a small brass plaque that read, "Office of Historical. Record Requests, Department C." To the world it was little more than a branch of public archives, but Miss Marple knew better. Department C had existed quietly since the Second World War, housing records too inconvenient for Parliament shelves and too honest for memoirs. Inside, she was greeted by a woman in her early 60s, hair tightly pinned, glasses balanced perfectly, on the bridge of her nose. "You must be Miss Marple," she said, her tone crisp but respectful. "My name is Margaret Finn. I received your letter." They shook hands. "You mentioned you were seeking material related to a Peter Carrington." Margaret led her down a quiet corridor. "We have 2 listings under that name. One ordinary, one less so." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe I'm here for the latter." In the reading room, a file box was waiting. No markings except a code, PX 1948 GR. Margaret opened it carefully, then stepped away, leaving Miss Marple alone. Inside were a handful of typewritten reports, some faded photographs, and a sealed envelope marked "Eyes Only, Ashbridge." Miss Marple read through the papers slowly, piecing together what she had already learned with what now lay before her. There were surveillance notes detailing Peter's final weeks, coded communications, intercepted letters, unexplained absences. But it was the photographs that struck her most. One in particular, taken from a rooftop, showed Peter and Amira in Bombay, standing by a market stall. He was not in uniform. He was laughing. It was dated 2 weeks after his supposed death. Miss Marple sat back. So the file had been altered. The official story had erased not only Peter's loyalty but also his survival. He had not died in action. He had been taken out by the system, silenced to prevent exposure of a post-war network that had grown too powerful. She reached for the final envelope. Inside was a single sheet, typed, a confession. The subject is loyal, too loyal. His relationship with the local contact, codenamed Seeker, has become personal. We cannot permit disclosure. Execute as accident. File closure approved. Ashbridge, Miss Marple read it twice, then carefully folded it again. By late afternoon, she stepped out onto the steps of the building. The sky had turned that soft, smoky grey of a London evening. Her heart was heavy but steady. She now knew that Peter Carrington had been betrayed not by enemies, but by those he served. A betrayal wrapped in paper and sealed in silence. She walked to a small cafe near Russell Square and ordered tea. The noise of London hummed around her, but her mind was somewhere quieter, in a garden in St. Mary, Mead, where a woman named Edith still waited for the full truth. When Miss Marple returned that evening by train, she carried only a small envelope in her handbag. But within it was everything. Later, she would sit with Edith in the parlour and hand her the photograph, the one where Peter laughed, and Edith would not cry. Instead, she would say softly, "That was his real face, wasn't it? The one they didn't." "Let me see," Miss Marple would nod, "but now you have it." Outside, the wind rustled the hedges gently, and for the first time in years, Peter Carrington's memory stepped into the light. Not as a soldier, not as a spy, but as a man who had lived, loved, and lost in truth. The rain had returned to St. Mary Mead, soft and steady, like the ticking of an old clock. Inside her quiet cottage, Miss Marple sat at her writing table, the envelope from London beside her, unopened since her return. She had already shared what was necessary with Edith, the truth about Peter Carrington's fate, the photograph of him smiling in Bombay, the report signed off by Ashbridge. But one item remained unspoken and untouched, a loose photograph tucked behind the other files. It had slipped free as she packed away the London documents, and for a while she hadn't looked at it properly. But now, on this quiet afternoon, with the rain gently sweeping across her window panes, she picked it up again. It was a photograph of a crowded room, a gathering of officials, men in suits, a few uniforms, a long table set for discussion. It appeared to be some sort of intelligence debrief, perhaps a strategy meeting or post-war planning committee. The faces were grainy but clear enough. At first it had seemed of little use, until her eye caught one man seated at the very edge of the frame. He was partially turned away, head angled downward, as if speaking to someone just off camera. But the shape of the jaw, the line of the shoulders, the collar just slightly askew, something about him tugged at her memory. She reached for Amira's notebook. Within its pages were sketches, rough outlines Amira had drawn from memory. Faces, places, symbols. On one page was a pencil drawing of a man Amira had called the Listener. She had met him only once, briefly, at a meeting where Peter had tried to keep her in the shadows. A silent observer. No name given. But Amira had noticed him because he wore gloves indoors. Miss Marple compared the sketch to the man in the photograph. It was not a perfect match, but it was close. Too close to ignore. And then her gaze drifted to the far corner of the photograph, to a folded nameplate on the table, turned just enough to reveal 3 letters in black ink, DLH. She stood up. A memory came rushing back, years ago. During the garden fete at the vicarage, a rather quiet man had visited the village with a cousin. Polite, pale, and precise. He had taken great interest in the layout of the village, asking odd questions about walking routes and secluded homes. He had been introduced as Douglas L. Hargrove. She had dismissed him as a minor civil servant, but now could it be? The next day, Miss Marple visited the local records office. With her usual gentle charm and an air of harmless curiosity, she requested electoral rolls from 1950 through 1960. And there it was, a listing for D.L. Hargrove registered not in London, but in a cottage just beyond the parish border, listed for only 8 months. No further address. No forwarding details. She visited the site. The cottage now stood empty, overgrown, its chimney crumbling, its garden returned to wildness. But something about it felt deliberate, like it had never truly been a home. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid the photograph, the sketch, and the registration listing side by side. The man in the photograph was not a mere clerk. He had been present at intelligence briefings, trusted with secrets. And he had once lived close to Elmswood, during the very months when Peter Carrington had vanished. She stared at the face again. If he had been the listener, then perhaps he had heard things meant to stay buried. That evening, she wrote, a letter to an old contact, a former librarian at the Foreign Office Archives, a woman who owed Miss Marple a favour from a long-forgotten charity dispute. The letter was short and direct. Could you kindly tell me what became of Douglas L. Hargrove? I believe he worked in or around intelligence logistics in the late 1940s. Any record of final posting or pension file? She posted it the next morning. 1 week later, she received a reply. Dear Miss Marple, Douglas L. Hargrove is listed as presumed deceased. Last recorded location, Afghanistan, 1951. However, no body recovered, no formal obituary, no pension. Claim ever filed. Strangely, his personnel file has a red seal marked transfer to quiet station. That term was discontinued in 1952, used only in extreme confidentiality cases. Curious, isn't it? Warm regards, H.F. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. So Hargrove had not died, not officially. He had disappeared quietly, like so many others. Tied to the web, Peter and Amira had tried to escape. But the term quiet station told her everything she needed. Hargrove had been moved, hidden, paid to vanish. That evening she visited Edith again. She handed her the photograph and the sketch. I believe this man knew everything, Miss Marple said softly. Not just about Peter, but about the entire operation. The files show he was present when Peter was ordered silenced, and I think he might still be alive. Edith looked down at the photo. Would it matter? She asked after a long pause. After all this time, Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Only if the truth still matters. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the stars were just beginning to peek through the thinning clouds. In the village, that thought, it knew everything. A new mystery stirred again, quietly, respectfully, but with purpose. Because whispers do not die. They wait. And Miss Marple, you listens. The phrase quiet station echoed through Miss Marple's mind like a bell in an empty church, soft, yet deeply resonant. It wasn't a term used by ordinary departments. It belonged to a time when secrets wore uniforms and names were exchanged for numbers. And it wasn't just about going away. It was about being made to disappear in such a way that even memory would hesitate to recall you. The notion that Douglas L. Hargrove had been transferred to such a place and never declared officially dead told Miss Marple something vital. Someone, somewhere, still knew where he was. And if that someone had written presumed, deceased, it was only because no one had cared enough to look closely. She began with maps. In her drawing room, she spread out an old government railway route diagram from 1948, a gift from a friend who once worked for the post office. On it were marked all the signal stations, both major and minor, that had operated in Britain during the post-war period. Her fingers ran slowly across the central lines, then toward the coast, then north to the hills. And there, nestled in the Tiu hills of Cumbria, she saw it, a small mark beside an old mining route, with the code QS-17. Most stations were numbered based on stops or mileage, but this was different. The QS could not be a coincidence. She made a note. 2 days. Later, she was on a train heading north. The journey to Cumbria was long, grey and rain-laced, but Miss Marple didn't mind. She preferred trains. There was a rhythm to them, the click of wheels, the soft sway of the carriage, the way strangers briefly became neighbours in the quiet dance of travel. By the time the train pulled into the small station at Grange-in-Furness, she had read through Amira's notebook again, making special note of a page with a scribbled symbol, a triangle inside a square. It meant nothing to her then, but now she remembered. Wartime outposts sometimes use shapes instead of names for those who couldn't be trusted with maps. From the station she hired a cab. The driver, a man in his 40s with weather-worn. Hans was curious. Not much out that way anymore, he said, steering the car through winding, sheep-dotted roads. Used to be some military folk up near the old quarry. All hush-hush, of course. Has anyone stayed on? Miss Marple asked softly. The driver shrugged. There's a man up near the ridge. Quiet sort. No one knows much about him. Locals call him the Keeper. Lives in the old station house. Miss Marple's heart gave a small, steady thump. When the cab stopped at the edge of a disused gravel path, she stepped out slowly. The air was sharp, the wind cool and thin. She climbed the hill on foot, passing rusted rail remnants until the shape of the old signal house came into view. Ivy now covered its lower walls, and one shutter hung loose from its hinge. But the roof was sound and smoke curled faintly from the chimney. She knocked once, no answer. Then again. A moment later, the door creaked open. A man stood there, tall, thin, white-bearded, with a hollow look behind pale blue eyes. He studied her for a long time but said nothing. "Mr. Hargrove?" she asked. His eyes narrowed. "I've come a long way," she said gently, "and I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to understand." A pause. Then he opened the door wider. Inside, the house was spare but tidy. A kettle simmered quietly on a wood stove. A bookshelf stood against the far wall, filled with old reports, a pair of glasses, and a framed photograph, face down. They sat in silence as the tea steeped. Finally, he spoke. "I thought I'd never hear that name again." Miss Marple folded her hands. "You were part of the decision?" "Yes," he said quietly, "but I wasn't proud of it." He explained slowly, without flourish. After the war, the British government had struggled to contain information about intelligence activities overseas, particularly those that involved questionable alliances. Peter Carrington had uncovered something about the shipment of sensitive materials and the betrayal of field agents who had outlived their usefulness. His refusal to cooperate with a cover-up made him a target. "And you watched it happen," she said. "I did worse," Hargrove replied, staring into his cup. "I signed off on the language. Executor's accident. I never expected they would actually kill him, but I knew once it was in writing, someone would act." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "Then why did you disappear?" "Because one day I saw his face, alive, weeks after his death notice, walking in Bombay holding that woman's hand, and I realized they'd failed, but they couldn't afford to admit it. So they buried the failure, Adi, in paperwork, and I let them." "Why?" He looked up, eyes glistening. "Because I didn't know who else to trust, and I didn't have the courage to make it right." They sat in silence again. Then Miss Marple opened her bag and pulled out Amira's notebook. "She trusted you were still alive. And she drew this." She opened the page with the triangle in a square. Hargrove stared at it. "That was our old clearance symbol," he whispered. "For messages that couldn't go through official lines. She must have known everything." "She did," Miss Marple said. "And she forgave you anyway." He blinked slowly. Miss Marple stood. "You can choose to disappear again, Mr. Hargrove, or you can help the truth take its final step. The choice, as it always was, is yours." She left the notebook on the table and walked back down the hill. Behind her, she didn't look back, but she didn't need to, because some doors, once opened, don't close again. The next morning, a brown paper Parcel arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, unmarked except for a return address stamped faintly on the back. SY Archives, London Division. She wasn't surprised. Mr. Hargrove had been quiet during their meeting, but something in his eyes as she left had shifted. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. A surrender, perhaps. And she had left the notebook knowing that it might do more in his hands than in hers. Now, as she untied the twine and unfolded the package, she discovered exactly what his choice had meant. Inside were two items: a sealed manila folder marked Yard Internal, 1948 case file, CN 47001, and a note, written in a clean, precise hand. For Miss Marple, I have done what I can. This is all that remains of the truth, or what they allowed to be kept. May it help bring a full ending to what we began in silence. D.H. She opened the file slowly. There were 7 pages. The first 6 were standard, the original. Missing persons report for Peter Carrington, statements from Edith, notes from the military liaison. Nothing unusual, but the final page was different. A single line circled in red, handwritten at the bottom by a now retired detective. Case never officially closed, per instruction from Home Office. Awaiting clearance. Miss Marple tapped her finger against the words. So even Scotland Yard had hesitated to declare Peter dead without a body, because the Home Office had intervened. And awaiting clearance was bureaucratic language for, we know something we're not allowed to say. She thought about Edith. All these years she had lived under the impression that her fiancé had vanished, then later that he had died. But the truth had hovered just above official paper, unspoken yet preserved. Miss Marple folded the file and stood from her desk. It was time to finish this. At Elmswood House the garden had begun to bloom. Spring had arrived early that year. Soft yellow daffodils framed the path, and the widow Edith Carrington stood near the gate with a watering can in hand. She smiled gently as Miss Marple approached. Another truth, I presume. Miss Marple nodded and handed her the file. From someone who could no longer carry the silence. Edith read slowly. As the wind picked up slightly and lifted the corner of the top page, Miss Marple saw a tear glisten on Edith's cheek. Not from pain, but from resolution. They tried to erase him, Edith whispered. But they couldn't. Not really. No, Miss Marple said, because someone remembered, and someone listened. They sat together on the stone bench by the roses. Edith opened her hand and let a small folded photo fall onto her lap. Peter, as she remembered. Him, youthful, full of life. She placed the file beside it, closed her eyes and said softly, "Then I consider the case closed in my heart." Miss Marple looked up at the trees, their branches blooming white against the blue. "I think he'd be proud," she said. "You both were braver than the world deserved." And with that, another whisper settled into the wind, carried gently away. It was one of those quiet afternoons in St. Mary Mead, the kind where even the birds seemed to be listening. Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, Amira's notebook open, in front of her. She had already read it many times, but something told her to look again. She flipped through the pages slowly. Notes, symbols, sketches, and then something new. In the corner of a page, written lightly in Amira's elegant hand, were a few simple words. Ashbridge, born not in London, but St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. Her expression didn't change, but her thoughts were racing Ashbridge, the man who had signed Peter Carrington's silent death, the one buried behind government files. Could he really have come from here, her village? She didn't speak, but in that moment she understood one thing clearly. The story hadn't started in London, or in Bombay. It had started right here, under her nose in the soil she walked on every day. She stood up slowly, crossed the room and opened a small cabinet near her writing desk. Inside were her own records, hand-kept village notes, a private habit of hers for years. Names, families, births and deaths, all carefully written down in neat, clear handwriting. She pulled out the volume marked 1900 to 1925. Her fingers moved down the yellowed page. And there he was. William Thomas Ashbridge. Born 1912. Parents: Thomas and Lucy Ashbridge. Address: Chalk Lane Cottage. Miss Marple remembered that house. It had been gone for years now, torn down to expand the orchard near the Harper estate. But once, a family had lived there. Quiet people. She remembered Lucy, the mother, pale, often ill, and Thomas, the schoolmaster, but she had never known they had a son. William Ashbridge had vanished young, perhaps for education, or for something else, something secret. The next morning, Miss Marple went for a walk. She passed the church, crossed the narrow path behind the vicarage, and stood at the edge of the orchard where Chalk Lane Cottage once stood. She looked out over the trees. Apple blossoms had just begun to open. She rested her hand on the bark of the nearest trunk. Somewhere here once a boy had played. A quiet boy, watching, listening, learning how people speak when they think no one. She is paying attention. A boy who would grow up to erase his name and become someone else. She didn't cry, but the weight of it all settled gently over her. That afternoon she paid a visit to Mr. Bascom, the village historian. Ashbridge? He repeated, thinking. Then he nodded slowly. Yes, William Ashbridge, brilliant boy, quiet, won a scholarship, I think. Left young, maybe 16. Did he ever return? Miss Marple asked. Not that I know of. His parents passed on. No one spoke of him again. Why do you ask? She gave a soft smile. Just tying up an old thread. But in her heart, she knew it was more than that. That evening she made tea and pulled out all the pieces again. Amira's notebook, the old school records, even the photograph of the ministry file. And then she looked again at the Ashbridge name. Something still didn't sit right. Then it came to her, Lucy Ashbridge, née Bray and Bray. That name did belong in the village. In fact, Lucy's younger sister had once married into the family that owned Elmswood House. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. If Ashbridge had returned to the village in secret, perhaps once, perhaps more, the only place he could have stayed without being noticed was Elmswood. The past hadn't just touched the present. It had lived inside it all along. The next day she returned to Edith. Do you remember your great-aunt Mabel? She asked gently. Edith nodded. Mabel Bray. She was a little odd. Collected things. Wrote letters no one ever read. My mother always said she kept secrets, even from herself. Miss Marple hesitated. Did she leave behind any papers? In the attic, Edith said. Boxes and boxes. We never went through them. Within the hour they were surrounded by dust and old trunks. It took time, hours maybe, but finally Miss Marple found what she was looking for. A small brown envelope. It read, WTA, keep safe. Inside was a letter, yellowed, folded with care, dated 1952. It was written by William Ashbridge. He spoke of regret, of decisions made behind closed doors, of names changed and truths buried. He mentioned Elmswood, the orchard, his boyhood, and a strange sentence that Miss Marple read twice. Sometimes I walk past the trees and wonder if they remember me. She folded the letter and sat quietly for a moment. Ashbridge was not just the man in the file. He had been a boy, a neighbor, a part of this village. He had chosen a darker road, but somewhere, deep inside, a piece of that boy still remained. She handed the letter to Edith, who read it with a long, thoughtful breath. I never knew, she whispered. Neither did I, Miss Marple said softly. But now we do. And as they stepped down from the attic, past the old wooden stairs and the faded wallpaper, the silence around them no longer felt empty. It felt full of voices, echoes, and things finally coming home. That morning, the village of St. Mary, Mead felt unusually still. The clouds hung low. The trees in the orchard didn't sway. Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage with a familiar notebook tucked under her arm. Amira's notebook. The words written inside were clear. Ashbridge, born in St. Mary Mead. She had confirmed it. She had traced the family. And now, something inside her told her to go back. Not to London, not to the archives, but to the orchard, the land where the Ashbridge family once lived. As she walked down the narrow lane behind the Harper estate, the gravel crunched softly beneath her feet. There was no sound of children playing, no wind through the leaves, just silence. When she reached the orchard's edge, she paused. This land, now blooming with early spring flowers, had once held Chalk Lane Cottage, William Ashbridge's childhood home. The past didn't just live here. It breathed through the trees. She took a few careful steps forward, moving between the rows of gnarled apple trees. The ground was damp. The scent of old bark and soft earth lingered in the air. Then a sound, a faint crack, like a twig breaking underfoot. She froze, not out of fear, but attention. Another step, slow, deliberate. She turned. From behind the thick trunk of an apple tree, a figure emerged. A man, older, his face weathered, his posture slightly bent. His coat looked out of place, too plain for a visitor, too worn for a stranger. But his eyes were tired and familiar. Miss Marple didn't need to guess. "You must be William Ashbridge," she said quietly. The man stopped. His eyes searched hers. Then after a moment he nodded, slowly, with shame, with acceptance. "I didn't come to hide," he said. His voice was low. "I came to remember." Miss Marple took a gentle breath. "That's why I'm here too." He stepped forward and looked around at the trees. "My father and I planted one of these when I was a boy," he said. "I think it's still here, bent, but alive." They walked together in silence until they found the tree. Its trunk curved, slightly, but it stood tall. William placed a hand on the bark, closed his eyes, and let out a long breath. "I was never supposed to come back," he whispered. "But you did," Miss Marple said, "and that matters." He looked at her again, this time with something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, and sorrow perhaps, or honesty. "I didn't kill him," he said, "but I signed the paper that let it happen." "I know," she replied, "and I think you've carried it long enough." They sat down on a wooden bench beneath the tree. Ashbridge spoke slowly, about the years he spent behind closed doors, about Peter Carrington's file, about how some names were erased, not because they were guilty, but because they were inconvenient. "It wasn't just one decision," he said. "It was hundreds, each one smaller than the last. And then suddenly, you're too far in to step back." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She simply listened. When he finished, she reached into her coat and handed him something. His own letter. The one from 1952. The one Mabel Bray had kept in the attic. "I read it," she said. "So did Edith." He took the paper in both hands, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. "I never thought anyone would read my words," he said. Miss Marple looked at him with gentle eyes. "Then perhaps now you can rest." The orchard remained still. "I'm dying," Ashbridge said quietly. "There's no point hiding it. I didn't want to leave this world with nothing but silence behind me." She nodded. "Do you want this to be public?" she asked. "No," he said. "Not loud, but known." "Then it will be known," she promised. As the afternoon sun began to slip behind the grey clouds, Miss Marple rose. She didn't offer to walk him back. He didn't ask. Some goodbyes are better left beneath trees. She left him sitting there, a man who had once been a boy, in that very soil, a man whose mistakes had shaped the lives of others, but who in the end had returned, not to erase the past, but to face it. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple picked up her pen. She opened a fresh page, and she wrote just one line. He came, home through silence, and the trees forgave him. The next morning the sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead. Mist hung low across the fields, and the hedgerows sparkled with dew. Miss Marple sat by the window, a warm shawl over her shoulders and a fresh cup of tea in hand. She had not slept much. Ashbridge's return had stirred more than memories. It had opened a door. She glanced across the table, where Amira's notebook still rested. But today something else caught her attention. A small faded leather book. It had been found tucked inside one of Mabel Bray's old trunks in the attic. Miss Marple hadn't opened it last time. Now she turned the cover slowly. Inside, the ray. Handwriting was delicate, looping, clearly a woman's, and the date at the top read April 1929. It was Mabel's diary she began to read. William visited yesterday. He came after dark. He never knocks, just appears in the orchard like a shadow. He looked pale, spoke little, but he handed me an envelope and told me not to read it, only to keep it safe. I think he's in trouble. I think something is beginning, and he doesn't know how to stop it. Miss Marple paused, her fingers resting lightly on the page. William had returned to St. Mary Mead as a young man, not just to visit, but to pass something on, something secret. She read further. There is a woman, he mentioned. E.H. I didn't ask more, but he said she had too many questions and not enough protection. I fear she may be in danger. He said, Mabel, promise me if anything happens to me, burn what I gave you. I didn't promise. And now I wonder, was that wise? E.H. Miss. Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Could it be Edith's mother, or someone else connected? She turned the page. The next entry was shorter. He says there are names that disappear, that files are changed, that people are turned into ghosts. He doesn't speak with fear, but with weariness, as though he has already lost something. Miss. Marple leaned back slowly in her chair. So Mabel had known. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand that William Ashbridge was more than a troubled boy. He was part of something larger, and she had chosen not to destroy the evidence. The diary entries continued sporadically. Mentions of coded letters, of meetings that never took place, of someone referred to only as the Pale Man, that name again. He had appeared in Amira's notes, in Carrington's files, and now, here. Miss Marple stood up and crossed to her bookshelf. She pulled down a slim red volume, The War That Wasn't, a quiet memoir written by a former intelligence officer. She flipped through the pages until she found the name, The Pale Man, a code name, used for someone who erased identities. Shifted Truths, a handler in the shadows, someone who answered to no one, except maybe himself. So Ashbridge had not acted alone, and if the Pale Man was real, he may still be watching, still working. Miss Marple's mind sharpened. The web was wider than she thought. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Edith standing there, breathless. There's something I forgot to tell you, Edith said. In one of the trunks, there was a second envelope, not addressed, but it has names, 3 of them. One is my mother's. Miss Marple didn't speak. She simply stepped aside and let her in. Together, they sat. The fire crackled gently. Edith handed her the envelope. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside were 3 typed names, Eleanor Harper Amira Zaid Peter Carrington, and beneath them a phrase typed in capital letters, redacted for Operation Mist Haven, Miss Marple exhaled. Operation Misthaven. She had seen that. Word once before, years ago. Briefly, and then never again. She looked up at Edith. "This isn't just about Peter," she said quietly. "Or even Ashbridge." Edith's voice was barely a whisper. "Then what is it?" Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "It's about a decision made long ago to hide something so dangerous. They erased the people who came too close." She rose from her chair and went to the small table near the fireplace. From a drawer, she pulled out a locked box, one she hadn't touched in years. Inside were her own notes. Old cases. Shadows never solved. Now she began to match them, because this wasn't the end. This was the middle, and someone, somewhere, was still pulling. The strings. The letter with the 3 names stayed on the table between them untouched. Eleanor Harper, Amira Zaid, Peter Carrington. All of them dead, each under different circumstances, yet all touched by something hidden. And now Miss Marple had a name for it. Operation Misthaven. She reached for her notebook, flipping through. Old entries searching for a thread. Any mention of that name from the past. Her eyes stopped on a faded entry from 1957. A case she had once been asked to forget. A man named Leonard Fisk, who vanished after claiming to have seen the file no one was meant to see. She underlined the word Fisk. Edith. She said softly, "Do you know if your family had any connection to a Leonard Fisk?" Edith shook her head slowly. "No, but I can ask my uncle. He was close to Aunt Mabel. He's in Sussex now." Miss Marple nodded. "Do, and quickly. We may not be the only ones looking." Later that day, she made her way to the vicarage. The new vicar, Reverend Hale, was a quiet man, young but thoughtful. She asked if he remembered any parish records for the Ashbridge or Bray families. He hesitated, then pulled out a set of keys. "There are old storage boxes in the church cellar," he said. "You're welcome to look." The cellar was cool and musty. Wooden crates lined the walls, filled with books, papers, and dust-coated ledgers. After more than an hour of searching, she found it, a visitor's log from 1951. Her heart caught slightly as she read it. March 3, 1951, W.T. Ashbridge. Attended evening service. Accompanied by 1E. Harper. Eleanor. So they had met. Not just through files or orders, but face to face. In a pew, in prayer, in silence. What had they shared that evening? What had been decided? She made her way home with a storm inside her. That one entry changed everything. Eleanor Harper wasn't just a witness. She may have been a collaborator, or a threat. Back at her cottage, she lit the fire, placed the logbook on the table, and stared at it for a long while. Then came the knock as she opened the door to find Inspector Reed. His face was tense. "You need to come with me," he said. "What's happened?" "We found something in Edith's garden." Within the hour they stood behind Elmswood House. A gardener had been clearing ivy near the far wall when his spade struck something hard. A rusted tin box. Inside it, more papers. Letters. One of them had the ministry seal. Another was handwritten, dated 1953, addressed to M.B. Miss Marple opened it carefully. "You were right to question me. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. Eleanor is not safe. She thinks she's controlling it, but she's not. The pale man is watching her too. They will silence her if she continues. Burn this. Do not answer." It was the proof. Ashbridge had known Eleanor was being watched, possibly even targeted, but she wasn't killed. Not right away. That meant there was more. Miss Marple stood very still. "What does it mean?" Reed asked. "It means," she said slowly, "that someone close to Eleanor, someone trusted, may have finished what Operation Misthaven started. And perhaps that person was still nearby, still watching." The evening was quiet, but Miss Marple could feel the weight of too many unanswered questions. Ashbridge, the pale man, Eleanor. And now the rusted tin box with its sealed letter. Each. Peace inching her closer to a truth that no one wanted spoken aloud. She returned to her parlour, placed the recovered letter on the table, and sat beside the fire. Her eyes wandered to Mabel Bray's old diary once again. She had read it several times now, but something told her she had missed a detail. She picked it up, turned to the final pages, and let her fingers trace the seam where the binding met. The spine, and something shifted. A tiny slit in the binding gave way. A hidden fold. Inside was a single sheet of folded parchment, thin, fragile, as if it had waited silently for decades to be seen. She unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten. The ink faded, but still legible. Dated March 1954. It was addressed to no one. But the tone was personal. I never wanted to be part of it. I followed orders. But this was different. The file wasn't just sensitive, it was poisonous. Names that could change everything, even now. I don't know why. Eleanor kept it, or why Peter insisted on hiding the copy. Perhaps he trusted her, or perhaps he knew she was being watched. Miss Marple read slowly, every line sinking deep. Ashbridge warned me. He said the file could get us all killed, but by then it was too late. Someone had already passed the contents to the pale man. Her hand stilled, so the file had been leaked, deliberately, not to expose it, but to control it. And Eleanor? She had kept her copy. Perhaps as insurance, perhaps out of fear, she turned to the last line. If I disappear, let the trees remember. I buried the truth where it can't be burned. The orchard, near the roots of the crooked apple, 1 foot east, under stone. Miss Marple closed the letter slowly. She looked up toward the window. The orchard. Again. It had become the resting ground not only of memories, but of secrets. She grabbed her coat. It was already dark, but she knew the way. The orchard path was quiet, the branches overhead like outstretched hands. She walked to the crooked apple tree, the one Ashbridge had planted. She knelt, gently brushed aside leaves and soil, and felt for the stone mentioned. There it was. Flat, cold, heavy. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small box. Not metal, but wood, unmarked. She carried it home before opening it. Inside old pages, crumbling but intact, typed paragraphs, official stamps, a ministry header, and red ink across the top, classified, Operation Misthaven, eyes only. The contents made her breath catch. It wasn't just about espionage, it was about control. A plan to reshape narratives, to change public memory, to turn inconvenient truths into myths. The names inside were real. Amira Zaid, Peter Carrington, Eleanor, Harper, and then one more, Juliet Bascom. Miss Marple paused. Bascom? That name belonged to the local historian, the same man who'd given her the Ashbridge birth record. Quiet, helpful, always around and always listening. She stood up slowly. This file wasn't just history, it was unfinished business, and someone nearby still had a reason to keep it. Buried. The photograph lay on Miss Marple's table like a ticking clock, silent but full of consequences. 5 faces captured in a single frame, each one linked by shadows, silence, and secrets. She studied them carefully. Eleanor Harper, her eyes alert, almost tense. Peter Carrington, hands in pockets, standing too stiffly. William Ashbridge, younger, still uncertain in his posture. Alan Harper, unreadable. And then the 5th man, the one with the pale eyes, unsmiling, unblinking, and unnamed. Miss Marple took a small magnifying glass from her drawer and studied the edge of the photograph. In the bottom corner, almost hidden in the grain, were 2 faint initials. RW, she jotted it down. That afternoon she paid a visit to Inspector Read. "I need access to Ministry archives," she told him, calm and clear. "Anything on Operation Misthaven dated before 1950, and I need to know if the initials RW match anyone on record." Read sighed. "You know I can't get that easily." "Then go as far as you can, Inspector," she said, "because I believe someone in that photo was never meant to be recorded, and yet there he is." Read agreed. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited the library, not the public one, but a personal one. Her old friend, Mr. Weatherby, had a private collection of rare political memoirs and declassified material. He was once a journalist in the Foreign Office, the type of man who saved what others buried. She showed him the photograph. He studied it, silent for a long moment. Then he leaned back. "I've seen that man," he said, pointing to the pale one. "Only once, at a closed press briefing in 1947. No name, no title. He stood behind a man from Central Office, but never spoke, just watched." "Do you know who he was?" Weatherby nodded slowly. "Rumor called him RW, but not his initials. It stood for Red Window, a code name." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Red Window?" "A project," Weatherby said. "Or maybe a person. No one could say. Files vanished, witnesses disappeared. The theory was that Red Window wasn't just a man, but the one who made sure doors stayed shut." Miss Marple sat still, thoughtful. So, the pale man was more than myth. He was designed to be untraceable. The next morning, Inspector Read returned with news. "There's no file on Operation Misthaven in open records," he said, "but I found a case attached to it. A woman named Fay Temple disappeared in 1950. She worked as a translator, and get this, she was posted at Elmswood House for 6 months. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Edith's family estate." "Exactly," Read said. "And her last known contact was Mabel Bray." Miss Marple stood slowly. "It's time," she said, "to go back into Mabel's attic." That afternoon, with Edith's permission, she climbed the stairs once more. Dust clung to every surface. The light from the small attic window barely reached the back wall, but Miss Marple saw it, a trunk she hadn't opened before. Inside, wrapped in a faded shawl, was a file. Not official, but organized letters, a journal, and a folded hand-drawn map. It showed Elmswood House, and beneath it, faintly inked, a second cellar, not on any plans, not listed in the estate records, but there, hidden, waiting. The map was crude, hand-drawn, but clear enough to show one thing. There was more to Elmswood House than even Edith knew. Miss Marple, lantern in hand, returned to the old estate that afternoon. Edith was waiting by the grand staircase, her brow furrowed. "Second cellar?" she asked, her voice uneasy. "So it seems," Miss Marple replied, "and I believe it hasn't been touched in decades." Together they made their way to the back of the house, past the unused pantry, through the laundry room, and down a narrow stone corridor. At the end was the known cellar, a wine room cool and silent, but Miss Marple wasn't interested in that. She turned to the wall behind the old wine racks. The brickwork looked solid at first glance, but closer inspection revealed a faint outline, a thin vertical line just wide enough to suggest a hidden door. Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced a small folding tool. She tapped the bricks lightly. One of them gave a soft hollow sound. She pressed it. There was a click. The bricks shifted. A door opened inward, slowly, revealing a set of narrow stone steps disappearing into blackness. Edith's breath caught. "I've lived here my whole life, and I never knew." Miss Marple turned to her gently. "Some things were never meant to be known, but secrets have a way of staying alive, even in darkness." She stepped inside. The air was thick, cold. It smelled faintly of paper, rust, and something else, old dust mixed with time. They descended the steps, the lantern casting flickering shadows across the walls. At the bottom was a small chamber, no larger than a bedroom. Along one side were locked cabinets, and on the other, a desk, a chair, and a pile of old crates. Miss Marple walked carefully toward the desk. On it sat a rusted metal box. She opened it slowly. Inside were reels of tape, notes, and a folder stamped Personnel Misread 3. She opened it. There in black and white was a name, Faye Temple. A photo was clipped to the file. A young woman with bright eyes and a cautious smile beneath it typed, "Assigned to Elmswood House. Translation of recovered communication, OP Red Window. Status removed, file closed." Miss Marple exhaled. So it was true Faye had been here at Elmswood, working on something too dangerous to survive. She looked further. A page of names. Several were crossed out, others redacted. But one remained. Untouched Juliet Bascom. Next to it, Monitor, trusted. Edith stepped beside her, her face pale. Bascom helped us organize the village archives. He knew every document in Mabel's collection. And he's the last one on this list, Miss Marple said. The last living thread. But there was more. A sealed envelope at the bottom of the box. She opened it inside, and a confession, not signed, but unmistakably written by someone with authority. Red Window was never supposed to exist. It was not a department, it was a purge. Eleanor tried to stop it. Ashbridge warned too late. And I helped silence them. I live with it every day. The orchard hides the bones, but the truth is in these pages. If you read this, do not seek justice, seek silence, because the ones who remember are still listening. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. So many ghosts. But ghosts leave trails, and the trail led to Juliet Bascom. The next morning the sun shone brightly, as if nothing dark had ever happened in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple knew better. She stood outside the small ivy-covered cottage of Mr. Juliet Bascom. For years he had been a gentle presence in the village. He helped catalogue archives, organized church fairs, even planted roses in the vicarage garden. But now she knew his name wasn't simply attached to dusty ledgers. It was buried inside. The most dangerous secret of her lifetime. She knocked once. The door opened almost instantly. "Jane." He smiled, surprised but warm. "What a pleasure. Come in. I've just put the kettle on." She stepped inside. His home was spotless, every book in place, not a trace of dust or panic, only calm. But Miss Marple had seen calm before. She sat in the drawing room, her eyes scanning the walls. Framed letters, certificates, nothing out of place, until her gaze stopped on a single black and white photograph on the mantel, the same one she had found earlier. 5 people, standing close. One of them with pale eyes. "You never mentioned you knew Eleanor Harper," she said softly. Juliet paused by the hearth. Just slightly, but it was enough. She was an acquaintance long ago. "And William Ashbridge?" He looked down. "Poured tea. We crossed paths." Miss Marple nodded, accepting the cup. "And Faye Temple," she added, her voice calm. That made him stop. His hands trembled just for a moment, then he set the cup down. "Why now, Jane?" he asked. "Because the time for shadows is over," she said gently. "And the orchard has already told its story." There was a long silence. Juliet moved to the window, his back to her. "I didn't choose to be part of it," he said finally. "I was asked to observe, to note, that's all. I never issued a single order, I never touched a single file." "But you passed information," Miss Marple said. He nodded slowly. "To Ashbridge at first, then Eleanor. But the moment things turned, the moment she started asking questions, they erased her, quietly, neatly. And you said nothing." "I was afraid," he said. "They said I'd disappear too." Miss Marple stood. "You were trusted, Juliet, by Mabel, by this village, by me." He turned, his eyes glassy. "I never thought it would come back. I thought it would all fade. But it didn't," she said gently. "The dead have voices, Juliet, especially when their names are buried." He sank into the chair. "Will you report me?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not the law," she replied, "but I am the memory. And you owe the truth to the ones who can no longer speak." Outside, the wind stirred gently in the garden. Juliet reached for a letter on the table, already written, sealed. "I wrote it last night," he said. "A full account. I wasn't brave then, Jane, but I will be now." She took the letter, placed it in her handbag, and gave him a small, almost motherly nod. "Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing to speak." She left quietly, the air sharper than before. Behind her, Juliet Bascom sat alone, his hands folded in his lap. The smile he always wore had vanished, because truth, when finally spoken, leaves no room for pretense. Miss Marple walked through the quiet village lanes of St. Mary Mead, the sealed letter from Juliet Bascom resting safely inside her handbag. The morning air was crisp and the church bells rang faintly in the distance, but her thoughts were not on hymns or tea, they were on endings. Inspector Reed met her near the police station steps. He had been waiting. "You said it was urgent," he asked, his tone steady. "It is," she replied. "This letter contains the missing confession, the truth about Red Window, about Operation Misthaven, about Eleanor Harper, Peter Carrington, and the one they called the Pale Man." Reed took the envelope and looked at her carefully. "Do you trust it?" "I trust the man who wrote it." "Now," she said. "But it took him 50 years. He opened it then and there." They stood silently. As he read, when he finished, he let out a long breath. "This ties everything together," he said. "Names, locations, timelines, even the orders." Miss Marple nodded. "But more than that, it confirms what we feared, that Fay Temple, Amirazide, and even Ashbridge weren't traitors. They were protectors of the truth, and they paid the price." Reed folded the letter and slipped it into an evidence file. "I'll forward it to the ministry. I doubt they'll acknowledge any of it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "But we'll know." Reed hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing. We recovered a tape from the hidden cellar at Elmswood. We had it restored. It's faint, but the voice matches government records. It's Eleanor Harper." He led her inside. In a small back office, he placed headphones over her ears and pressed play. The tape crackled, then a woman's voice. "If this message survives, let it be known that I never gave them what they wanted. I hid the file. I trusted Peter to make the copy disappear. If you're listening, you must understand. Red Window is not about war. It's about silence. And what they fear most is a woman who remembers." Miss Marple closed her eyes as the tape ended. For a moment she said nothing. Then she removed the headphones and looked at Reed. "Let them fear us then," she said quietly. "We remember." That afternoon she returned to her cottage. Edith came by later with tea and a small pot of rose jam. "You heard it, didn't you?" Edith asked. Her voice. Miss Marple nodded. "She was brave until the end." They sat in the parlor, the fire crackling softly. "I think Mabel would be proud," Edith said. "She would," Miss Marple agreed, "and relieved." Outside, the trees rustled gently. The orchard stood quiet but no longer haunted. The story had been told, not with shouting, not with headlines, but with steady hands, quiet voices, and truth, passed from one woman to another, across time. And in that silence, justice had finally bloomed. It was a Sunday morning in St. Mary Mead. The air was soft with early sunlight, and birds called gently from the hedgerows. Miss Marple stood by her window, gazing across the quiet garden where lavender bloomed and the rosebush, once Mabel Brays, bent gently in the breeze. So much had passed, yet the world outside looked the same. The final letter had been sent, the tape had been filed, and Juliet Bascom had left the village quietly in the night, his confession sealed behind him. No arrest, no headlines, just a departure. That was how these stories ended, not with gavel and courtroom, but with whispers and memory. Edith arrived mid-morning, carrying a small wooden box. "It belonged to Aunt Mabel," she said. "I think you should have it." Inside were small tokens, a pressed flower, a child's drawing, a tiny key with no lock. Memories ordinary yet priceless. "Thank you," Miss Marple said, gently running a finger over the worn lid. She held so much inside. It was stronger than I thought, Edith said, and quieter than she deserved to be. Miss Marple nodded. That's often the way with women like her. They shared tea in silence. No need for more words. Later that week, the orchard was open to the village again. No warnings, no mysteries, just apple trees under the sky and the sound of children laughing as they ran between the trunks. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the path watching. Reverend Hale approached her, hands behind his back. "I'm told things are resolved," he said gently. "As much as they ever are," she replied. He looked at the orchard. "We still don't know who the pale man truly was, do we?" "No," Miss Marple said. "But perhaps that's how it should be. Some ghosts are better left unnamed. What matters is that he doesn't haunt this place anymore." She turned back toward the village, where the houses stood with lace curtains and blooming window boxes. Life was returning to its gentle rhythm. As she reached her gate, she paused. A letter was waiting in her postbox, no return address. Just a small wax seal. She opened it slowly. Inside, a single line in unfamiliar handwriting. "You saw more than you were meant to, but you said nothing we didn't already know. We thank you. M." Miss Marple smiled. A nod from the shadows. Then, perhaps from those who once hid the truth, or from those who had once protected it. Either way, her work was done. She placed the letter in her drawer and returned to her armchair. The kettle was whistling. Outside, the church bell rang for evening prayer, and inside her cottage, Miss Marple finally allowed herself a moment of stillness. The mystery had ended, not with fury, but with peace, because the truth had been seen, and, in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, it would never be forgotten.